drink Jack Daniels, dark things happen. It took me a while to learn that. I just don't do Jack Daniels anymore. I got a lot of other vices, trust me. But Jack Daniels and me, it just doesn't sit right. But I was under a bridge in Spokane, Washington. I was looking for marijuana. I didn't know what to do. Marijuana was one of the few things that settled me, my soul. Still does. And I am so happy it's legal because I don't have to hide anymore. And that stigma is a powerful, powerful thing. But I was under this bridge and I'm walking. One thing I've gotten good at as I've gotten older is walking. I'm still hearing voices. They still talk to me. But I get walking and I can move. And I walk through these streets of Winona. I walk through these old streets of Winona. I walk through old buildings, newer buildings, and I hear the sounds of yesterday talking. I'll never forget, and there's a story in that new book about driving my little green Volkswagen. You remember that green Volkswagen, Mrs. P? I drove that Volkswagen from 7th way down to the East End and back one night, again and again and again. And as I'm hearing the voices coming from the houses. I'm hearing the voices coming from the people. I'm hearing the voices coming from there, up there, down there, up there. I hear them coming from the television set. I was one messed up person. When you go down to the psychiatric unit, they give you medications, horse pills, Haldol, Thorazine, and Stelazine, guaranteed to make you drool. And you walk like you got a 200-pound weight around your neck. You walk like this. You can't hardly talk. You can't hardly talk. And if you know my mom and aunts, a Hanson not being able to talk. But I was under this bridge. And to this day, I don't know if this person was real or not. I was under this bridge, and this lady appeared, and she was all dressed in black. She had a long nose and the longest fingers. And she pointed at me. She pointed at me and said, the devil's coming to get you. He's inside your soul. What's the man do? Run. I ran. And it wasn't until I met Ernest Hemingway. Now, for those of you who know, Ernest Hemingway died in 1961. This was 1977. Yeah, I was messed up, wasn't I? And I was in bed one night on the psychiatric unit. I'd been there for 4 or 5 weeks, you know. Doctors didn't know what to do. Walking around numb. I mean, just nothing meant anything. You didn't have any emotions. It was all neutralized by these huge pills. And usually once you went to bed, you go to bed about 7 o'clock. They give those pills to you about 5:30. By 7 o'clock, you're dead to the world. There ain't nothing. You go in and you kind of slumber over your bed and you just crash. And you don't wake up till the nurses come in the next morning and draw some blood. They're always drawing my blood. Those doctors saved my life. They saved my life. They gave me time. But I was sitting there and I was half asleep. I heard noise down at the end of my bed, and I tell you, the characters you run into on a closed psychiatric unit, they're special. And with your regular normal kid, and I was relatively normal, you ain't never seen like nothing like the people inside a closed psychiatric unit. There were 20 of them there, all outside of our minds. All outside and all living in different worlds. Well, Ernest Hemingway woke me up one night. I come to and I hear a noise down at the end of the bed. I figured somebody's rifling in my pockets for the 62 cents I had. Or most people in a closed psychiatric unit are pretty poor at that juncture of their lives. I thought somebody was taking my 62 cents. So I kind of come up and I ball my fist. I get all ready. I figure if I'm going down, I might as well go down hard, right? And I look up and I saw this haze. Kind of a haze down there. This guy says to me, "Right like you are there. You small words." And then he was gone. It was gone. Of course, I fell right back asleep because the drugs were still in me. They were still running through me. Got up the next morning when they drew my blood. I could hear my old man. He was a Marine, you know. He was a Marine. Stubborn old coot. I can say that now that he's gone. But I could hear him that night, that day, and I still hear him today, saying, "Charge that hill, you face those demons, and you don't back down, you keep pushing." That was my old man. It's one of the things we shared. One of the things that was part of us. That began my road to recovery. At that moment, I realized I had to take the bull by the Lena Weinberg. I was in charge. Turned off those voices. I went in 2 more times. I had setbacks. It's like an addiction, I suppose. 2 more times. I went in and I haven't been back since. However, I turned around and got myself better. Guess where I went to work? On a closed inner city psychiatric unit in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. And the nurses, you want to know what they said to me? They didn't know. I didn't let people know about my bout through mental illness. So I didn't let my coworkers know. Just like I didn't let my kids know as they grew up about my mental illness. Hello. Lost my train. Oh! They said, "Merle, we really like working with you. We could put you in a room with a dozen schizophrenics, and we can't tell the difference." I love my work on the closed psychiatric unit. I met people of all extremes. I met schizophrenics, I met manic depressives, I met multiple personalities disorders. I worked with a psychiatrist by the name of Diane Bay Humanansky. You want to talk about an interesting person? You Google her, Dr. Diane Bay Humanansky. She was a multiple personality psychiatrist. We'd have people come in after her session. They would have hundreds of new personalities. It was shocking. And it took a great deal of effort for us to get her out of the hospital. And eventually the court system took care of her to the tune of $10 million of lawsuits. But she disrupted and she destroyed some people's lives. Psychiatrists are really, really important. People are at their most vulnerable state when they're on a psychiatric unit. And they can really mess somebody up. I was lucky. I was very lucky. I had great insurance. I had supportive parents who, Mom's not here, but I'm sure they didn't understand me because this is a journey. So I want to thank the Winona Post for that newspaper article. And if you see me walking the streets, don't run the other way. Come talk to me, please. I want to hear your stories. I'm going to turn it over to Joe here because Joe's hung with me from our beginnings when we first started to talk together. All yours, buddy.
Okay, can you all hear me? Now that's good. People usually hear me pretty well. And it is absolutely true that Merle and I go back a ways. Our friendship dates back to when I knew I was going to wind up in Winona. My wife had just passed away. This is 2011. And I'm really just looking for something to do with my time. I wasn't ready to go out onto the dating world just yet. And so I dove into the depths and happiness of my Polish ancestry, my Kashubian Polish ancestry. And when I buried my beloved Lisa in Winona that spring, she and I had a deal. She would pick out our retirement address, which was going to be somewhere in her native Tennessee. And I would pick out our permanent address, which was going to be 1333 Old Homer Road, Winona, Minnesota, 55987. Anybody know what you'd find if you go there? St. Mary's Cemetery. And that's where she is, next to my mom and dad. So I knew I was moving up here. And I knew I had the old-timey story stuff bad. And I discovered Merle's work. And we would correspond. And I just liked his stuff. I thought of myself more as a historian back then. Then I climbed into the bottle and got spent 5 years drunk. I sobered up eventually and realized, hey, I get to move to Winona. It was the lockdown. I had a year and a half left to teach. I could teach it from anywhere in the world. And I came here to Winona. And there was a story idea I had from one of the things I was reading in the newspaper, and I ran it by Merle because it was a case of bastardy. I mean, do people even get sued for bastardy anymore? I mean, bastardy. I mean, it's not the kid's fault. The kids don't pick out their parents and stuff like that. It's kind of cruel. But there was a case of bastardy in Winona involving a Polish girl in 1875, and I kind of recognized the last name of the villain. And the last name of this villain is more or less the name of some very influential people who have contributed a great deal to the city of Winona, Minnesota. In fact, I was just driving by caught her today. And I said unto Merle, this is really a great story that I want to write and publish in a book, but it is, the villain is the ancestor of a whole tribe of people who helped found Fastenal. And he goes, oh, okay. And I said, do I even want to be writing this stuff? And he says, oh, no, if you run into any of them, they'll just laugh. They'll think it's hilarious. They're cool about this stuff. Burl said, go ahead. So there I was at Peter's Beer Garden, about to read a story called The Polish Scandal. And I was rearing it up, and I let it rip. And this well-dressed, dapper gentleman, looking really casual and stuff like that, looked a little older than me, and he said, oh, I just wanted to come up and tell you how much I enjoyed your talk. I laughed, and I said, well, thank you very much. I'm glad for the feedback. Oh, it was great. He said, oh, by the way, my name is Tom Sloggy. Well, anyway, here's the story. There was a young lady who came over from Poland with her parents. Her name was Susie Eichmann. It could also be spelled Ekman. It can be spelled a lot of different ways. And face it, most of the Polish people who came here didn't know how to spell their own names or anything else for that matter because they couldn't read or write. It was no big deal. So Susie Eichmann came over to work as a domestic here in the bright lights of Winona. And this is the year of our Lord, 1875. Winona is not the roll up the sidewalks at 6 p.m. sort of place it is now. This is Frontier 1875 Winona. You've got fist fights and winos and prostitutes skilled in the arts of tango, lies, and exploitation. It's just like totally crazy and nothing that anybody from our time could imagine. Well, anyway, she gets a job and she's living on the foot of Mankato. And she meets this handsome dude by the name of Franciszek Szlagowski. Franciszek Szlagowski. You can understand why he went by Frank Slaga. And Frank Slaga was handsome and charming, and he was insistent. And Susie Eichmann tried her best to defend her virtue, but on one night in the spring of 1875, Frank Slaga and Susie Eichmann went over into the stables at the Lamberton Mansion, and something happened. Then something else happened, and Susie found out that she was pregnant. She went to Frank Slaga and said, okay, you promised to marry me. Here I am. I'm ready to go. And he said, I was kidding. What's a poor Polish girl who is like 16 years old? Her parents live in Trempealeau and they speak Polish. What is she going to do? Why, she went up and lodged a case against him for bastardy. She sued him for bastardy. And whenever the Polacks out in the East End started acting up, that's when the newspapers got interested in us. And here you've got this 16-year-old girl with the pastor of St. Stan's sitting at her side telling the whole story of how it was she was seduced by that varlet, Frank Slaga. The whole town knew all the details. And guess what? Nope. Everybody agreed. The jury agreed. Frank Slaga was found guilty of bastardy. He had to pay support for the future of a young baby named Paulina, who was born in January of 1876. Unfortunately, the baby passed away pretty quickly and stuff like that, so you'd figure that poor Susie Eichmann, she was really lost. That, she had sued the guy for bastardy, he was bound to pay for the upraising of their kid, and now it looked like he had just walked off. There was a silver lining at the end of this story. What happened is that Susie Eichmann, the tarnished woman, the harlot who had given birth to a child out of wedlock, got married to a gentleman from Büthof named Julius Betker. They lived at 767 East Front Street, raised a fine family of good children who made their place in this world. One of them was a cop. They were all involved in the church. She had a good life. Frank Slaga, he really didn't make it after all. His wife finally cut him loose for alcoholism and stuff like that. He died young and nobody missed him very much. But it all worked out for his family, if not for him. Frank Slaga, as he was known, was the grandfather of Len Slaggy, who was the grandfather or the father? No, the father of the Slaggy family that helped found Fastenal, right? Yeah, so, I mean, this guy was an absolute rotter, but his family turned out completely all right. You just never know what's going to happen on the foot of Mankato. Thank you very much.
I'm going to read a couple stories here. And then I'm going to tell you about my walk in the Kowaleski Saloon one night and meeting some of the characters in Kowaleski Saloon. Heroes come from many different places. Sometimes heroes come from the top strands of society. Other times they come from its dirtballs and low grades. Life is an interesting place. Most of us, when we were 16, 17, thought we knew just about all. And we weren't afraid to tell older people how smart we were. I kind of look back every once in a while and I realize I really wasn't so bright at that time. And then again, I ask myself, am I still not so bright? Maybe I'm still learning. Well, one of the people who's a hero, and he's gone now, and all that's left of is his brother Bob. But he came from a tough environment. They lived down there by St. Casper's on West 4th Street, not too far. And those homes sometimes got a little wet in the spring. Tough living, tough people. We rose up. I had roots down there. We rose up. And those people who grew up in those small houses just like they did in the East End, they made something for themselves. They started little, and they decided they're going to be good citizens. They're going to be good people. They're going to care. And that's the story of immigration and people coming in and making something better for themselves. We all rose up. Winona had lots of money back in the day. Lots of money. And lots of really, really poor people. So this story is titled Ed Mikuleski. And I don't know if I pronounced that right. I get the Polish names. They're special. Ed Mikuleski, he said, the sun poured through the windows facing the lake and the bluffs as I sat watching my day pass. The bar was filled with people sharing their days, and old grizzled vets stood tall, remembering their fallen comrades. There was a fresh falling of snow outside, and the sun flew from the heavens. I died at the Battle of St. Louis, July 17th, 1944. Funny name place to take your last breath. Company K, 29th Infantry. I was a replacement for men who lost their lives at Omaha Beach. Less than a month earlier, many of the boys who served had died at Normandy. You don't find men like them every day. I took a sip of my beer. A privileged beer, I thought. Privileged to live in this country. Privileged to write the words I do. Privileged to raise a family and see children and grandchildren grow up. Ed didn't get to see what we take for granted as artillery and bombs fell on his head. He was still talking. I grew up in the West End, 4th Street, not far from St. Casimir's. A couple of sisters and a little brother, Bob. Didn't have much of anything but a basket full of good memories. I carry those memories with me today. I didn't graduate from high school. Drove a Federal Bakery bread truck. Loved the smell of fresh bread. Married Evelyn Zimmerman. Had a son, Gerald Edward. Little Ed, I called him. He is gone, as is Evelyn. She remarried, and I was happy for her. And little Ed, Rogarby, was a good man. I'm buried out there in St. Mary's Cemetery. Come out and visit someday. Bring your lawn chair, crack open a beer, and let's talk. It gets lonely out here in the lands of the old town. Time swirled as I sipped my whiskey, thinking of Ed and countless others who made it back home, no longer breathing. I never served. I don't think it would have been healthy for myself or the country or anybody else for me to be handling a gun in my condition when I was 19 years old. But I respect the boys who served, the men and women who served, the men and women who stood up for what we all believe in, what we all feel, what it is to be an American. I'm still friends with Ed's younger brother, Bob. He's getting up there in years. And he was tickled pink when he heard I was going to put his brother's story in this book. Started tearing up. Good man. We can't forget yesterday. We can't forget the good people who were here before us. They're what make us. They made our myths. They're who we are. Can't forget them. And as a generation much younger than you, we haven't done a good job of telling our myths, our stories, our feelings to the younger generation. They don't have any idea what we're talking about. Anyway, I was out drinking one night. Sometimes, well, I used to walk into churches in the middle of the night. They were open because they didn't have this graffiti problem like they do nowadays. And I could feel the quietness. And I'd sometimes run into somebody there. It was a place you could go where it was dark, it was quiet, it was spiritual. You weren't doing anybody no harm. You weren't doing anybody nothing. But you just wanted a place where you could think and talk. Yourself, mind you. But that brings me to Jake White. Now, Jake White was a plasterer. And he hung out at Kowaleski Saloon there at 3rd and High 4th Street. Down there where used cars are on their last leg. In 1962, that building burned down. It was Billy Reinhardt's stained glass studio. It burned down, and there's a long story Joe can tell you if he wants to tell you about getting an address screwed up, and so it sat and burned. And with it, when that woodwork comes down, the voices stop. When they tore down the Morgan Block downtown, it was sad because that was the heart of Winona. That was where the stories were. That's where our grandparents hung out. That's where our people hung out. That's where people laughed, they talked, they drank, they lived. Your younger generation don't remember the Morgan Block, I bet. It would have been its last legs when it came down, what, 76. Now, it was in rough shape by the time it got tore down. But it was a real part of our history. You ask a young person, they ain't going to have any idea. Anyway, I was walking in the East End. It's dark down there in the East End, and when I was down there, it was really dark. Well, you don't want to walk down there, especially if you're from the West End. They're very protective of their turf, you know what I mean? Well, I had stopped at St. Stan's before there, and I stopped into the old St. Stan's. And the original St. Stan's was there on 4th and Caramona. And I don't think it was as big as this room here. It was just a really little thing. And it was just an intense time down there because that little bitty church back in the 1890s, they had to have 9 services on Sunday because it was growing and it was bumper to bumper. I mean, people were right on top of each other. And if we have any of my Polish friends in here, you know they don't like to spend money till they have to. And they had the money in the bank, but there was such a conflict between Bishop Cotter and Claver and then the ladies of the Holy Rosary Society. I mean, you don't tell those Polish mothers. So anyway, after I went into the old St. Stan's church there, it wasn't called St. Stan's, was it?
Yeah.
Well, it was the old St. Stan's church, the little one. I went in there and I said my prayers. I'm still a Catholic boy. You know, I don't go to church, but I'm still a Catholic. You can't, it's part of your thinking. It's part of your way of doing. So I'm thirsty. So I headed down to Kowaleski Saloon. And at the table there, at the bar there, I got by all the Kowaleski women because they were a tough bunch of girls. And I sat down next to Jake White and Joe Knitter. When I saw Joe Knitter there, I got a little bit nervous because Joe only had half an ear. He'd gotten drunk one night along with Bernard Sopa. And Bernard decided he wanted to chew on Joe's ear. Yeah, we come from some sick people in this town. They're part of our soul. Well, he lost that earlobe. So you always knew you were sitting by Joe Knitter. Joe Knitter was a horrible man. Oh my gosh. But he had the most dedicated wife in the world. She hung with him. He was pregnant. And he came in and he started pounding on her. Pounded on his belly, one after the other. This pregnant mama. She wouldn't. She stuck with her man. Finally, Joe Knitter died. I don't know when he died. Yeah, okay. But you know what? Despite that, they had 3 kids. Despite that, they had 3 kids. And they moved them out of town. The stigma was too much, or you got to break a cycle. They moved them to Michigan, somewhere up there. And you know what? Those kids all got up on their feet. They all stood up for themselves. Well, I didn't have much to say to Joe Knitter. What do you say to a guy like that? I just didn't want him to start fighting me, that time I was only 145 pounds. I was just a skinny thing. I wish I was still skinny. Jake White was next to me. Jake White was a plasterer. He did the big, tall things like that. Only the Saints, he was a plasterer for St. Stan's. And believe it or not, Big Red, the Basilica, was a French church. It was designed after a French church in Chicago, Illinois. Our Lady of Notre Dame. So I'm talking to Jay about this stuff, and he's talking about jobs. He's talking about C.J. Mayberry, who was the town architect, did the courthouse, did St. Stan's, did the Mayor Brothers house, the original Mayor Brothers house in Rochester, Houston County Courthouse. I mean, he was the big time architect. Yeah, the Homer School. That was Mayberry's last project. He lived over on East 8th, just a block east of where the old Diocese Center was on 8th. There's a house that's all kind of constructed, kind of funky, with the C.J. Mayberry house. Anyway, I sat down to Jake, and Jake said, they got me going down to Chicago. They got me going down to Chicago. And I said, well, what for? He says, we're going to get this church done. But we want to make sure you can do the plastering. We want to make sure that you can fix that upstairs, because we got to bring New York people to do that. That's too expensive. The parish council isn't going to budge. And there was some serious fighting on that parish council, because there were a lot of those Polish families who sometimes wouldn't talk to each other for long periods of time, generations sometimes. They were mighty good at holding grudges. Just like I think we all are. And Jake says to me, he goes, I did it. I haven't been the same since. And I asked him, what do you mean? I don't understand. And he says, I'm up there doing that plastering, and I could hear the sins of my fellow Kashubians, my fellow Polish people coming up, leaving their hearts, coming up through the church, and exiting out through the dome. I said, you sound like a brother of mine. The Polish people got a strong God. I mean, I was a St. Mary's parishioner. Sometimes I feel like there were two different gods. Yeah.
How come the other guys didn't beat him up?
I can speak to that. Okay, the question is, why on earth didn't somebody preferably Bart Sopa should have, he shouldn't have stopped at the ear. He could have just like bit off, just anything that he else could find that could work, and done Winona a favor. What happened was that Joseph Knitter he's in the newspaper as being a wife beater. He was a repeat offender, and his wife still kept bearing his children for reasons best known to Jesus. Okay, so yeah, it was just a classic pattern of a battered wife, compounded by the fact that a Polish wife was supposed to be subservient to her husband, and this one was, and what happened was she was beaten to death right before Christmas. She died of a hemorrhage when her husband Joseph Knitter beat her to death. And the thing is, the city of Winona, people in the city of Winona tried to reach out and say, this guy is a bad actor. This guy can be fixed. This guy can be sent to, get this, a clinic in New Jersey where he can, quote unquote, take the cure. And this dude was the biggest, meanest, most awful drunk in the city of Winona. And the county board said pass, because if we send him off to take the cure, then we have to send off all of the drunken Polacks and all of the drunken Bohemians after that. It's a valid case of somebody where this is 1896, and they're trying to do the right thing by getting this guy some help. It may or may not work, but at least they're trying something. And it didn't. What happened was Elizabeth died, and Father Paholski came to take her final confession, perform the last sacraments, and she refused to say her husband killed her. And like I said, he did get pasted walking back. The time is... I was just going to say that I wasn't there at that conversation that Merle was just talking about, but John R. Beam was. John R. Beam was at the time maybe a 19, 20-year-old kid who had emigrated from Poland. And in the year 1890, he had just found out that he was getting his dream promotion to telegrapher on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. And he wanted to celebrate. He went down to the sleaziest bar in the city of Winona. The place where, if you'd already been kicked out of every other bar in Winona, you could go to Kovalevsky's. The only thing is, you had to pay cash. Kovalevsky didn't believe in credit. And there is a wonderful story about the Polish empty night where Jake White and Frank Curlin were supposed to keep track of the dead body. It's a long and complicated story, but Jake White has been one of my favorite people to think and talk and write about. He's very dear to me. So yeah, he was at the conversation with John R. Beam, and they were talking about, marriage, and they were both kind of drunk. And Joe said, turned out Jake White had been a widower for 11 years. Basically, he was the plasterer, all right, but he was a sober and good working man before his wife passed away in 1886. And he did indeed. He was the finest plasterer in Winona. There was no other man that C.G. Mayberry would work with. But, he was tormented. He had it really bad. He died out on the poor farm in 1906, which was out there by Woodlawn Cemetery, if I recall correctly. It was just really sad, but the highlight of John R. Beam's evening was listening to Augie Dahmer, a German, and Vince Kukowski talk about the sadness and the woes of being married to each other. Vince Kukowski said, "Hey, I just got appointed to the police force, and my wife, that's not good enough for her. She says, why can't you be more like J.B. Bamanek? Why can't you be more like T.J. Sikorsky? All the important Polacks had two initials back in those days. And Augie Dahmer said, oh, geez, you think you've got a reference. My wife should be happy with me. I used to live in this little slum at 69 Carmona Street. I think it's kind of like a garage. I mean, you're talking about cramped in bargain basement 1859 quality housing. But Augie moved them all to a nice house on 5th Street. That was a nice street. And they went on and on and on and bickered because that's what they did. Beam never did get to celebrate his good news. Jake White basically shuffled off and, slept it off. But 1 year later, a block from Kovalevsky's saloon, June 6th, 1891, Officer Vince Kukowski pulled out his gun, said stop, and shot Augie Dahmer down at the corner of 2nd and High Forest. It wasn't a murder mystery because everybody knew who did the killing. The thing was, they were friends. What in the heck is going to make a police officer at 2 o'clock in the morning in the alley out behind the biggest, lousiest dive in Winona with a woman pulling his gun and blasting somebody who was one of his best friends? What's up with that? I'll tell you next month. Thank you. Questions? Yes, Gail.
Yes, the Bernard sofa that you're talking about. I'm married to a Bernard sofa. And he was way down the line because they were all sofas. And he was a